As an entry-level economics student, you are probably well familiar by this time with the general supply and demand curve. We have our price quantity, our supply curve, which slopes upward, and our demand curve, which slopes downward. Now, to be more specific with macroeconomics, we're going to take that supply curve. This is for a market, so it's the supply curve for a good or service, and the demand curve, the consumer demand for that same good or service, and we're going to make it about all goods and services in the economy. And we're going to do a little bit of name changes for that as well. So for demand, instead of just demand for one product, it's going to be all products, so we're going to call it aggregate demand. Aggregate, the word means all together, and when we do the nomenclature on the board, we're just going to add an A right there in front of the D for aggregate demand, AD, aggregate demand. For supply, we're going to make it aggregate supply, and actually technically this is the short run aggregate supply, more on that later, but for now we're just going to put A for aggregate supply there. Now we've transformed these to be about all goods and services, both supply and demand. We're going to have to make adjustments to our axes as well. Here's Q, it's a quantity measure. It's still going to be a quantity measure, but we're now going to call it Y. Y is a measure that means output. It can also mean production. It can also mean real GDP. And in our case now, it's going to mean employment as well. We're also going to need to modify the P. P meant price before, but now P is going to mean price levels. So before, when it was Q, as you go to the right on the x-axis, there's more quantity of stuff. In this case, there's more output of all things, or more real GDP, or more employment. And on price levels, as you went, when it used to be just P for price, as you went higher with P, the price would go up on a particular product, but now it represents price levels because we're talking about all goods and services. Now there's one more graph we need to add to this to make it complete, and that is the long run aggregate supply. Now the long run aggregate supply is kind of like a limit. It is like the waves are crashing against the shore, and here's the limit. Here's as far as the waves can go. This is thought of as the long-term limit for how much the economy can produce. In fact, where the LRAS intersects with the x-axis, we're actually going to call that FE. And FE represents full employment. That represents when economists think that employment is maximized, but keeping the natural level of employment in there. That's what full employment is. You may see that aggregate supply just stays AS, and the LR indicates it's not the long run, but you may also see from some folks, you may also see that it has an SR before it. So you have your short run aggregate supply, your long run aggregate supply, and your aggregate demand. Now, wouldn't it be cool if there were a short run aggregate demand? But there's not. There's just one. There's not a short and long run. It's just one aggregate demand on the chart. Now, theoretically, the LRAS can actually shift. If the long run potential of the economy is not doing so hot and the potential for the economy is going down, it would shift to the left. And if the economy's potential is growing, as it does normally for countries that are doing well, it would shift to the right. But when we use this graph, we just make this a constant, and it just stands there, and the other graphs are going to move around it. We're going to go ahead and run a few scenarios where the aggregate demand is going to shift. The first thing is, let's say it's 2007 or 2008, and there's this huge bubble in assets and debt, primarily sparked by a problem in the US housing market, and a collapse happens, and as a result, demand is weaker. So then aggregate demand would shift to the left. Remember, left always means less, and so if you get less demand, it's going to shift to the left. Here we go. So aggregate demand has shifted from AD to AD1, and as you can see, the intersection of the aggregate supply curve and the aggregate demand curve is here, but the full potential is here. What that does is that makes this area in here a negative output gap. This makes it a negative output gap. That's how the United States and many other countries looked during the 2008 recession. This is thought to be temporary, and in many cases governments intervene, or the market improves and aggregate demand will slide back out to the right. Or another thought is that this short run supply will actually increase to kind of capture the demand that's still left, and it will end up intersecting back on the full employment line on the long run aggregate supply. So that is going to be a temporary measure. There's a second kind of negative output gap that can happen, and that would be a supply restriction. So we would take our short run aggregate supply, and there's going to be less of it, so we're going to shift it to the left. So you have a shift to the left in short run aggregate supply. You were at equilibrium here, but now your equilibrium is here. You're also below where you should be. You're to the left of where you should be in terms of the long run potential of the economy at full employment. And you're also, in this case, going to have a negative output gap. An example of this would be the 2020 COVID-19 recession. It was a real short recession, a really deep recession, but what happened was, and there was demand affected too, but after the fact, the dust settles, a lot of economists were calling this a supply restriction as we weren't able to work and produce more stuff. In the previous example, when the intersection was down here, we had lower output and lower price levels. And in fact, we grappled with those lower price levels for years after the 2008 financial crisis. But in this case, we actually have a restriction of supply. If you look, it actually pushes price levels up, which partially, in my view, explains why we are currently still battling inflation that started briefly after that recession. This is not thought to be permanent, of course. It will end up back on the LRIS, either the supply restriction event, whether it's a pandemic, or oftentimes we describe oil crises where oil is real expensive or restricted this way as well. That'll resolve by supply shifting back outward, or demand might shift over here, increase in order to absorb what supply is available, and intersect up here back on the LRIS, but yet with higher price levels. We just had two examples of negative output gaps using this model. Let's go ahead and look at two positive output gaps according to this model. Suppose, for example, that a new technology comes along, and a good example would be the fracking technology, hydraulic fracturing. Rather than just drilling straight down for oil, we're going to drill down and then we're going to go horizontally in order to extract more oil from the ground. Oil is used in a lot of products in the economy, so perhaps when this technology got widespread, it actually increased our supply of oil and then increased, as a result, supply of everything else in the economy. It might have looked something like this. So you have a shift to the right, because there's more of it, of the short run aggregate supply, and your employment levels go above capacity, the long-term capacity, and the price levels are going to drop, and this would create a positive output gap. Hold up, you might say, how is it possible that we're doing more than we're allowed to do? This is our limit. We can go below our limit, our potential, but how are we going above our limit? The example I often give for this is, do you want to work 100 hours every week for the rest of your life? And most of you would answer, no, I'd prefer not to, or actually I'm not capable of doing that. I'm not physically or mentally capable of doing that. And then I might ask, well, could you do it for 2 weeks while we have a big run-up in production with a deadline coming up? And a lot of people would be like, yeah, I could probably do that for 2 weeks. Just make sure you bring me some donuts in the morning and pizza in the afternoon so that I can keep my energy level up. So it's a temporary shift beyond capacity, is what we would call a positive output gap. This is not thought to be permanent. Either the supply will retreat back to where it was, or demand will actually drop because there's less demand for what's available, because since there's more stuff, and it will end up either equalizing down here or meet somewhere else on the long run aggregate supply. The final output gap we're going to look at is if demand for all goods and services, aggregate demand, it increases for everything. Perhaps there's an income rise, or there's just strong consumer sentiment, or people are in a spending mood on the aggregate, something's good happened, a positive feeling, then temporarily it's going to create a positive output gap, which is right here. It's shifting from AD to AD1. You have a positive output gap, price levels are up and production levels are up. Employment's also, again, beyond capacity temporarily, and it's thought to be temporary. Eventually that exuberance will calm down and people will go back down to their normal. Or, since it's out here, supply will actually restrict to try to soak up some of the demand, and it'll shift here, intersect here, and it'll end up back on the long run aggregate supply curve where it stays in the long run, unless you're having a positive or negative output gap. Now that model I just showed you is kind of a teaching model to kind of explain it to entry-level students. What you're going to see when economists are presenting, when macroeconomists are presenting to governments or businesses what's kind of going on, you're going to see it this way with a time horizon, a time measure on the x-axis, and on the y-axis we're going to put y, which is our real GDP. You're going to see two different lines. The dotted line here is going to be your potential y. That's your potential y, or your trend line, your long-term, what is expected. That's the limit. We see it's growing over time, but that's kind of the long-term limit of where it's thought the capacity of the economy is. You're also going to see the real number, which I'm going to put in green. All right. If the dotted line is what's the potential and what's actually happening is in green here, we're going to see real quickly when we go beyond our potential. Again, this dotted line is very much like that straight up and down LRAS. That's the long run aggregate supply. Now we're just calling it potential for the economy, or potential for Y. And this line is what's actually happening, which is, you could kind of represent that as the aggregate demand and short run aggregate supply as shifting back and forth. Our economy is kind of tracking it here, and then it goes into a positive output gap here as we are beyond capacity. Then there's a recession, here's your peak, here's your trough, and then it takes a while to recover even after the recession's over. This here, when it goes below trend, is going to be considered a negative output gap. All of this would be a negative output gap. You cross the line again and go back into a positive output gap here, which doesn't quite end at the end of our chart there. So that's how you're going to see it represented in when you actually present it outside of the teaching model that I went over previously.